Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are around the world. Thank you very much for joining. I'm going to begin sharing my screen. But again, welcome to this session. We'll be talking about resilient leadership, maintaining a strategic mindset amidst crisis. My name is Gary Guadagnolo, and I work at EAB, which is a global higher education research firm. We work with over 2,100 providers around the world to identify and share best practices on every aspect of university operations. I'm very pleased to be joined in this session by representatives of two of our partner universities, Libby Wilson, the Director of Transformation at Sheffield Hallam University, and Louise Bond, Head of Programs at University of East Anglia. Both Libby and Louise have had a tremendous amount of experience leading change programs and have had central roles in their institution's responses to the pandemic over the past 18 months. So I thought they'd be the perfect people to discuss this topic under consideration around resilient leadership. We'll be hearing more from them in just a couple minutes, but first wanted to set the stage for our discussion today. No news to you, but for a year and a half, we've been dealing with multiple crises that have touched on every corner of our institutions. The operational challenges alone have been enormous, but it's been interesting that we at EAB have continually heard comments from our partners like the one you see in the middle of this slide. Something along the lines of, our executive team is managing this crisis day to day, hundreds of operational decisions. We're exhausted, but what worries me the most is that the urgent is crowding out time for strategy. Are we prioritizing the right things? And that's the goal of today's session, to discuss how we can make sure that we are prioritizing the right things as leaders amidst all of the other things that could potentially be taking up our time and energy. Now, without a doubt, all leaders balance a caseload of management and leadership responsibilities. In an ideal world, the time and effort devoted to these tasks would largely remain separate, with some occasional overlap. In crises, however, we see a lot of what we call crisis management creep, where all of a sudden, any and all leadership time, so the time and energy devoted towards that long-term thinking and planning for the future, is crowded out by day-to-day crisis management. Now, there's several factors that contribute to this. One is stakeholder anxiety. So in terms of extreme uncertainty, our stakeholders, our staff, look to leaders, look to us, and expect us to provide guidance and direction. Second, there's no playbook to reference. It's largely seen as the leader's place to step in and take over management when new and unfamiliar and really challenging tasks arise. And third, irrelevant urgency. So when every single decision seems to be high stakes, leaders often find themselves getting pulled into conversations and meetings around operational tasks that chip away at leadership time. I won't ask anyone to raise their hand for how much time they spent discussing plexiglass, for example, over the course of the past year. But clearly, there are a lot of obstacles to strategic leadership and thinking during a time of crisis. And unfortunately, the battle to get out of crisis management creep often feels like an uphill one. But in fact, our brains, the very way we're hardwired to operate, are actively working against our attempts to be strategic in these moments of crisis. Here's what that means. Crisis brings stress, and stress has an enormous effect on how we think. Just a few of the ways that it interferes with our ability to be strategic leaders. First, it makes us more likely to act on habits rather than goals. When we're stressed, our brain prioritizes conserving energy, eliminating uncertainty, and making quick decisions. That means that habits are way more appealing than effortful, goal-driven behavior. Two, stress makes every question or decision an all or nothing proposition. To eliminate ambiguity, our brain ends up eliminating nuance. And so black and white, yes or no, all or nothing propositions are even more appealing. And finally, stress puts us on the defensive. We respond the same way physiologically to a stressful event that we would to a physical threat. And that produces some noticeable patterns in our thoughts that we call defensive crisis thinking. Now, on this slide, I've listed out 5 different patterns of this crisis thinking and how they may manifest in the higher education sector. The first thing to note about all of these, and of course this is not an exhaustive list, is that they're rooted in fundamentally adaptive behaviors. And that means that they help us to attend to stressors in our environment and defend ourselves from future harm. But that fundamentally defensive positioning inhibits our ability to be strategic. In the interest of time, I'm not going to walk through all of them, but I'm going to call out just 2. So the first one here is isolationism. That's the instinct that when a crisis hits, we may decide to turn inward. That can lead to a decrease in collaboration or communication across departments as everyone focuses on how they can secure resources. Or it could mean that previously regular calls, networking events, meetings with employer partners or peers at other institutions fall off the calendar. As a result, your perspective becomes more narrow and internally focused, as we tend to lose some of the important inputs from the environment around us that actually helps make our decision-making richer. The third crisis pattern on this slide is the need for social proof. Similar to the principle of loss aversion, during a crisis, people are especially wary of taking risks, and few people want to be the first mover. The reluctance to announce reopening plans is a good example of this in the sector. Many institutions were concerned with releasing a plan that later would turn out to be wrong in the eyes of peers or in the eyes of public health officials. We're concerned about the impact that any announcement would have on either enrollment or retention or campus operations and more. As you read through these, you may find yourself nodding along, and if so, would love for you to share in the chat about which of these crisis patterns you've seen on your campus and how they've manifested themselves. And while you do that, I'm actually going to turn now to our panelists and ask them the same question. Which of these crisis thinking patterns have you seen on your campus in the last year, and what impact did it have? Libby, let's start with you if you don't mind.
Thank you, Gary. And it's just so interesting to think about this, sort of in the phase we're in now with a bit of distance from March 2020. And I guess the aspect that we were perhaps most anxious about was isolationism, concern that without the physical presence, collaboration would start to disintegrate, I guess. And actually, I think this is probably the one we worked hardest at. And from a professional services point of view, we went into the pandemic having recently completed a full restructure of all professional services. And that gave us really clear lines of sight and accountability from decision-making to delivery. And I think that made managing the crisis so much easier than it would have otherwise been. But it also made it easier to identify and pull in the expertise and the experience to inform decision-making. So we had a gold and silver group structure, as I imagine many organizations did, and that worked really well. But even then, I can recognize some of these other things on your list. The idea of anxiety for social proof, I think is probably something I couldn't have articulated as clearly as that, but I definitely recognize. And the risk of irrelevant urgency. I think in a crisis where the strategic becomes the operational, and you have to spend a lot of time thinking about frictionless operational delivery and managing operational questions you would have not given much thought to previously, from how to get teaching stationery to the right places, to distributing home working supplies, to food parcels. It's really easy for that to creep up on you, and the point at which that's no longer a strategic decision, you're still talking about it. So really interesting list, and I guess the need for social proof and the irrelevant urgency were two that jumped out at me, but also isolationism was something that we really focused on trying to avert as we went into the crisis.
Great, thank you, Libby. Louise, can I pass the baton over to you?
Absolutely, thank you. I think just building on that isolationism point, again, like Libby, you go through this list and you think, yeah, I can relate to all of those, but actually the silo working, I think culturally we've seen in our organisation. So I think that was, as Libby says, a concern going into this, but actually reflecting on it, as I was doing before this today, we actually had much greater cross-functional working, and it's partly, what Libby's referring to in terms of, that sort of business continuity, gold, silver structure, all the way down to sort of operational delivery of that. We actually really had people coming together in a really positive way. So although I think you could see people slightly battening down the hatches, when you're in the room and working through the issues, actually everybody came together and collaborative. I think also psychic numbing, I thought, is an interesting one. So just for context, we've come out of the sort of COVID response, moving through to hybrid working. We've got significant campus development, building work going on. So we've almost gone from one piece of change to another. And I'm seeing that, it's that change fatigue, isn't it? And just that motivation and engagement is hard to sustain. and actually you sustain it for the pandemic, but then actually you've got to keep it up, and it's another thing and another thing. So we've done a lot around clear communication and engagement, and really trying to understand those individual and group drivers. But yeah, I think that's, for me, that's a challenge at the moment, is working out how we maintain that motivation when, that quote at the start, everybody's tired. So it's how we keep that up.
Yeah, not surprising at all that over the course of the pandemic and doing all of this, that last one begins to crop up, right? It's kind of the one of just this fatigue and the burnout, if you will, that people are feeling. And thank you both for sharing. What I think is interesting here is because the work that both of you and your institutions have done early on to particularly chip away and kind of work against that idea of the isolationism that's so important, and also interesting, just the pre-work in some ways that you all have been doing to kind of lay the ground. It is about communication, but there's certainly an organizational element too, and being able to carry that forward. On this slide, I won't spend too much time here, just listed a few kind of interesting ideas for how teams and individuals can begin to work against some of these crisis thinking patterns. All of these are small everyday habits. The one I think is interesting, I'll call it the psychic numbing here at the bottom. Again, it's this kind of overload with everything that we could be thinking about. One potential tactic here is thinking about the impact on individuals and prioritizing storytelling and framing issues and challenges in terms of how they impact individual people can help to draw our problem or attention to a problem at scale that's easier to process and to connect with, rather than trying to wrap our minds around something like the scope of an entire crisis like a pandemic. Now, each of these individual strategies, I think, can help redirect crisis thinking when it crops up in the moment. But when it comes to developing more of that strategic mindset, there are some more enduring principles and practices I wanted to call out quickly here. So 3 steps to creating a strategic mindset. I've included a few questions to help you root out and think through these patterns in your own decision making and team making too. But the first is to make the unconscious conscious. One of the reasons that these crisis thinking patterns and other stress responses are effective and pervasive is that they happen outside the level of our consciousness, that they're a gut reaction. You can't always tell when they're happening. But once you're made aware of these tendencies, they're much easier to root out. So you might keep that list of crisis thinking patterns handy and run through them whenever you're tempted to make a knee-jerk decision or process with your teams. Hey, if we fall into any of these, let's guard against them. The second is to take a stress is enhancing approach. So for all of the negative consequences of stress in our cognition, there are good ways that, or good reasons that our brain reacts the way it does. Stress allows us to be laser focused on solving a problem and devote extra internal resources and energy to making a decision. So realizing, hey, what did that time of clarity and really intense thinking, what did that allow us to do? Where have we devoted energy that we never have before? And then third, practice cognitive flexibility. We know that stress can make our thinking more rigid, constrained, and inflexible, and that thinking strategically requires actually the exact opposite. So to counteract those effects, we need to practice cognitive flexibility, our ability to think about problems and decisions from multiple angles and perspectives, and to switch back and forth between multiple concepts. Now, when we as leaders develop habits like the ones on that last slide to guard against crisis thinking and to build up the muscles related to a strategic mindset, that leads to what's known as organizational resilience. Given a rather formal definition here, the ability to effectively absorb, develop responses to, and ultimately transform in the wake of disruptive surprises that potentially threaten an institution's survival. Now, that's probably where most of us want to end up in theory. But I'd like to make the idea a little more real. So Louise and Libby would love to again hear from you both. What does organizational resilience mean to you in the context of your own campus? How have you seen it play out in the past, over the course of the past year? And what has enabled that resilience? Louise, can we start with you this time?
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose I think the first thing to say that as a campus university, I think it demonstrated to us how exposed we could be. We've got that multiplicity of functions, everything's delivered on site. So I think that complexity gave us a real sort of pause for, okay, how can we work through this? And I think what the pandemic did do is it broke down historical barriers. So we touched on siloed working, cross-functional teams resolving issues, at the individual level, people switching roles and priorities, decision making was quicker and decisive, more and regular open communication. So all these responses that happened, and I was so reflecting on that in terms of what enabled that, what enabled us to be able to respond in this way. And I think from my perspective, it's very much about, it was enabled by culture. And actually, we are a campus university. Visitors comment on that sense of community and how it feels to be part of, that village feeling. And actually, that strong identification with the university and that shared sense of community was what pulled people together. Mm-hmm. So I think actually, in terms of, what enabled that resilience for us, it's very much that shared sense of community. And I think going forward, it's how we maintain that in a very different way. With hybrid working, and the physicality of that campus community has changed, and so it's how we take that forward.
Mm-hmm. And Louise, if I can ask a follow-up question there, I think it's interesting. In many institutions said, we were able to make decisions quicker, maybe dissolve traditional hierarchies and bring the right people in the room at the right time. That makes sense and is a great crisis response. How can you continue to kind of deploy some of those practices in hopefully in a time that does not feel quite so crisis-like, but we still know that getting the right people at the right room at the right place, the right time, that is so effective in building a resilient organization.
Absolutely, and I think as we move out of that mode, it's trying to find the balance between the two. If you think of a university culture as generally very consultative and very engaged, we had to switch that behaviour, and then it's transforming your leadership, isn't it, into a different mode. So some of the things we learned around more transparent communication with the executive team. We had Q&As for all staff to ask anything about what was happening. So we're putting some more structured ways at place so people feel more involved in decisions and discussions and able to understand the rationale behind what's happening, but sort of not maybe switching completely back to that very involved traditional sort of structure of lots of meetings and committees. So it's trying to find that balance between the two, I think.
Sure. Thank you, Louise. Libby, can I get your take on what organizational resiliency means to you?
Yeah, thank you. I think for us, a lot of it was thinking across multiple time horizons. So really quickly in spring 2020, so sort of April time, we set up a group that was specifically looking at what the post-pandemic world might be like, with a view to that being able to both inform near-term decision-making, so we make decisions that are going to be consistent with our longer-term direction, but also to be absorbing the learning from the crisis. And I think Louise has articulated it really well, that sense of agile decision-making we discovered, and that highly collaborative networked organisation, cross-functional teams, a whole different ways of working you might have seen in a project environment, but not in a whole organisation environment. So being able to kind of stand back from that and go, what can we take from this? We've had this great disruption. What's the innovation we can take? And how do we start hardwiring that into how the organisation works at a cultural level, as well as in how we organise our governance and so on. And I think there's a really strong cultural thing here about the crisis required us to tap into experience and expertise right across the organisation. There's some really positive messages off the back of that. So how do we take that listening and learning into being part of our culture moving forward? So I think for us it was, and we talked about it a lot with the wider staff group, about there being two time horizons here. There's the crisis, but there's the world after, and we need to be looking both forward and backwards at the moment.
Mm-hmm. I love that mindset and that approach, and particularly devoting that team to say, hey, this is the time horizon you're thinking of, and guarding that team and their work time and energy, right? That very much is in alignment with what we've been talking about, that otherwise the here and now just crowds out that time. So I think it's a really great idea. And the other thing that both Libby and Louise have said here in this section here, what I think is interesting, is that really this is about culture. And that's the point I wanted to make here in the next few slides, and with this image as well, that organizational resilience is not just a leadership quality that can be mandated from the top. While it certainly can start there and can be set, the tone can be set there, it really has to manifest itself in every aspect of an organization, from the mindset of individual stakeholders and how they participate in the institution, to the behaviors that we all engage in while at work, to the larger environment on campus. So let me quickly just wave at each of these ideas. So first, starting with an individual stakeholder's mindset. So the top right of the slide, 3 features of that mindset that I would say manifest in a resilient organization. A strong sense of purpose with core values. This is someone who is engaged with his or her work, sees how it connects with a larger institutional mission, shares a sense of values with other stakeholders. Second, a desire to question fundamental assumptions. This is interesting to me. I think it's a great thing that we do within the walls of our classrooms and our research labs, but perhaps not always quite so well in our policy and decision making. Too often I think we fall back on the status quo because that's the way we've always done things. A resilient mindset begins to question some of that status quo. Third, alertness and mindfulness. This is a mindset characterized by engagement outside of one's day-to-day responsibilities, a desire to integrate broad parts of the institution into a daily workflow. So again, if we remember from that earlier discussion, crises and stress push our thinking to be narrower, whereas this resilient mindset really is characterized by a broader questioning approach. The next layer here is the behavioral. So how those at our institutions engage and approach their everyday work. I'd say there are 3 characteristics at play: resourcefulness and ingenuity, engagement and counterintuitive thinking and idea generation, and development of practical, generalizable habits. There may feel like a bit of a tension between 2 and 3, but I would say it's kind of about efficiency, that resilient people don't sweat the small stuff. They standardize, maybe even automate some of those practical tasks, and then think about, how can I spend my valuable time, my limited time and resources, on more demanding activities, counterintuitive problems, things that are really contributing to the institution as a whole. And then finally, we have to ensure that we're promoting a resilient environment. And this is what we were talking about a second ago as well. It's one that promotes psychological safety, deep social capital, and resource networks, and diffuse power and accountability. Simply put, a resilient environment is one in which people feel safe, connected, and effective. Now, flew through those aspects of a resilient organization quickly, but wanted to make sure we spend a couple minutes here as we wrap up thinking about how this plays out in practice. Resiliency, as we've talked about already, isn't built overnight. It's not something you just flip on. So it's important to recognize early successes on that journey, as we already have with Louise and Libby, and also set intentions for where you'd like to be. I've listed a few ideas on this slide for what a resilient organization might look like, kind of snapshots from across the campus, but also wanted to give our panelists the final word. So Libby and Louise, my question for you is this: if we were to reconvene a year from now, how do you hope that your institutions and teams will be more resilient? What do you think will be the signals for you that show you're on the right track? So Libby, I'll give the virtual microphone back over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, really interesting to think about this. I think there's 2 things for me. One is that we, in a year's time, will look across the year and see that we've really embedded that integrated cross-university strategic and operational planning. We're all pulling in the same direction, and I think we achieved a lot of that in the crisis. It's holding on to that integrated way of working, putting the time and energy into it. And I genuinely think that would make such a difference to our resilience levels. But there's also something that picks up on your last slide, which is around the embedding of values and the building of social interaction and social capital in the hybrid working era. We're all at the beginning of this journey. There is no playbook. And we're, I think, looking for the ways in which we can get the best of both worlds. And one of the challenges, I think, is seeing how we get the balance right so that you get the social interaction and capital coming back, but you do so in a way that enhances equality, and those things together give you resilience. So for me, that's absolutely top of my list of things to be thinking about across the next year.
Libby, a brief follow-up question for you, and to your first kind of comment about the kind of the planning bit. I mean, there's a world in which you think about, what is the policies, the process, how can we try to rewrite some of those rules to make sure we're getting all the right inputs and we're asking people the right questions at the right time. There's that bit of how everything flows on paper. And then there's also the cultural bit. What work have you done, or are you thinking about doing to kind of build in that more of that engagement and that the culture change bit of that work?
I think there's something really key about what are the operational groups that we hold on to moving forward as we come out of crisis. We're still operating in a challenging environment, but even as that eases, how do that really strong connection between academic planning, technical services, IT, all of those different enablers, spending more time together, looking ahead, what can we do that will really move this forward? And it's preserving that, the time we've given to that over the last year. How do we hold on to that? Because there's real strength and innovation that comes through that, as well as resilience. So for me, it's how we keep the contact time and the time spent thinking about these really integrated issues as part of our normal ways of working, and don't slip back into silos. So that's, I think, key for me.
Great, thank you. And Louise, for you, what are some of those signals of success, or that you're on the right path towards building a more resilient organization? What would that look like for you?
Really interesting, just to pick up on Libby's last point, actually, around what we're holding on to from what we've learned. So, as part of those cross-functional teams, we've held on to some of the more operational, bringing everybody together, quick problem solving, rather than waiting to resolve issues. We're trying to resolve them as they arise. So we've held on to those structures, slightly refined, frequency, but actually that's working really well. I think coming back to the culture point, absolutely critical. We now build on our the strong foundation we had pre-pandemic, how we maintain that. We've just transformed our people and culture division. So we've got a new organizational development team that we're hoping are really going to, work alongside us to look at that cultural model. And as I mentioned earlier, that challenge of how we sort of maintain and develop a campus community when actually you've got a very different way of working, and you've got a virtual campus as well as a physical one. So I think I'd like to see establishment around the campus community in the virtual world. I think I'd like to see cross-functional teams operating more as a norm. So, whereas there might be barriers normally for secondments or moving people, actually being more flexible in how we approach it and bringing people together to solve issues, and actually really embedding the engagement. So I mentioned that we'd started doing staff Q&As. We've maintained those for professional services. We're looking at doing them for academic colleagues. So keeping that visibility and engagement going.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Well, that 30 minutes went by very quickly, but thank you. A huge thanks to both Louise and Libby for your contributions here. And I'll wrap up the session on this slide with a few takeaways about promoting and striving towards resilient leadership. One of my colleagues will be posting in the chat a link to a resource center with some other tools that might be helpful in follow-up to this discussion, and certainly an invitation as well to let me or any of us know if you have more questions or thoughts here. But again, thank you all for joining. Thank you, Louise and Libby.